Hey, what is up, mortals? Welcome to part 6, season 2. I just wanted to greet you guys by just saying, sit back and relax, you're in for a treat. So, we begin. The final exams went on smoothly, with some people passing while others didn't. Among those who passed was Todoroki, who had shown greater control over his flames. But it was far from over. The best was about to come, for it was time for the final match. Omni-Man and All Might, two of the strongest heroes in the world, were up against Izuku and Bakugo, two of the strongest students at UA. To most people, this seemed like an attempt at finding someone that could match the strongest students, while also being a battle between father and son. But it was more than that. This was very much a battle between the strongest of two different categories. But it was also a fated encounter between master and student. Class 1 all gathered in the monitor room, waiting in anticipation for what was to come. They all mingled with each other about what was to come, but they didn't know what to think. They knew that their classmates were strong. They were facing much stronger opponents. I wonder what will happen, Kaminari said, as he patiently waited alongside his classmates. The room was silent, for no one knew how to respond to this statement, until Kirishima decided to speak up. I don't know what will happen, but one thing is for certain, the odds are not in their favor. I'd go as far as to say that they're basically zero, the redhead said, his voice showing seriousness as opposed to the usual excitement. Stop thinking so little of them. A cold, and rather aggravated, voice then exclaimed. Everyone was caught off guard by this, as they turned to see that the words had come from Todoroki. The bi-colored teen looked as cold as always, but his eyes showed some hint of annoyance as he spoke. I'll admit that their odds are terrible, but that won't matter. I've been around the two of them long enough to know one thing. They are far too stubborn to quit, Todoroki said, his voice being firm and certain. Class 1 didn't know how to react to this, for they didn't expect it. They knew that Todoroki had been training with both Izuku and Bakugo. But how were they already this close? They all sought the answer to this question, until their attention landed on Todoroki's left hand. It was covered in various burn marks, some looking minor while others didn't. This made them all realize something. He's been working really hard. Not only that, he's been doing it alongside Izuku and Bakugo. If the three of them had been training so hard side by side, there was no wonder why they now seemed to be so close. Quiet down, it's about to start, Aizawa then said, his tired voice silencing everyone in the room. The class did as their teacher had told them, before turning their attention towards the giant monitor. The screen showed a fake city, right as both Izuku and Bakugo walked right into it. The duo seemed to be relatively calm despite their situation, but that couldn't be further from the truth. It was just a facade. Both teens were actually trembling with fear and uncertainty on the inside. They entered the field in silence, both trying to calm their nerves as much as possible, until Izuku spoke up. So, we definitely need a plan in order to win. With an uncertain voice, Bakugo just growled upon hearing this, as he responded by saying, win, we'll be lucky just to survive this, his fear and stress only serving as more fuel to the fire behind his aggressive tone. Izuku did not react to this. He only nodded while saying, I agree, so we should definitely run away, with a tone that signaled a desperate call for urgency. Do you honestly think that we'll let you escape? A familiar, yet sinister, voice then made itself known. Both teens turned their terrified expressions towards it, only to see the red cape waving in the wind. The teens both froze. But the one that was on the worse end was Izuku. He was even more terrified than Bakugo, for this wasn't something he had seen before. The once comforting and warm face of his father was now a cold and twisted shadow of its former self. They stared at each other in silence, the teens not daring to make as much as a sound in the presence of Omni-Man. As the game of intimidation continued, then a sudden gust of wind, originating from the far end of the street, speeded towards them all. Bakugo was immediately knocked off his feet, flying backwards, as Omni-Man dashed at top speed while grabbing Izuku by the throat. The green-haired boy didn't even have enough time to register the waving of his father's cape before he was forcefully dragged away. Before he could even register what was happening, he had been thrown straight into a building, far away from his blonde companion. Struggling to properly address his surroundings, Izuku dragged himself up to his feet, grunting in pain as he did. But he didn't get a chance to properly think of a plan before hearing, how long are you going to keep me waiting? Izuku froze once again, as he turned to see that his father was patiently floating in front of him with his arms crossed. He couldn't move a muscle, and it would appear that his vocal cords had been frozen as well. He didn't know what to do. There wasn't anything that he could do. His father was superior to him in every way. And it didn't help that he looked as monstrous as he did. The green-haired boy desperately tried to think of what to do, until the only thing that made any form of sense came to his mind. It was to run as fast as possible. So he didn't waste a single breath. He took off immediately, flying as fast as he could manage, but it was all for naught. It didn't matter that he had reached top speed immediately. It didn't matter that he had moved so suddenly. His father was still ahead of him. Nolan had grabbed Izuku by the foot, holding it with an iron grip, as he looked on with a monstrous glare. "Did I say that you could run away?" the unlicensed hero then said, before throwing his son into another building. Izuku managed to brace himself this time. Therefore, he didn't take as much damage as before. He didn't get to rest, however, for his father quickly followed up by punching the green-haired boy through another structure. The battle continued in this fashion, with Omni-Man chasing Izuku around the entire area, leaving a path of brutal destruction in their wake. Class 1 observed this with wide eyes, unable to fully process what they were seeing, but one of them seemed to have a moment of realization. So this is why Midoriya is so tough. His father has trained him like this all this time, Hiroshima said, sounding like he was both shocked and awed. The class also had a similar realization after hearing this, for it made sense to them. If Izuku had been put through such brutal training by his father, it made sense for him to be this powerful. But some weren't convinced. "No, something's wrong," a feminine tone exclaimed, a deep hint of worry present in its voice. Everyone turned to see that it was Uraraka, staring anxiously at the monitor. "So you also noticed it," Todoroki then added, his voice sounding cold. Everyone turned to them in confusion, wondering what they were talking about. Todoroki kept observing the screen, as he then spoke up. "This is nothing like how Midoriya explained his usual training. This is far more brutal. I know that he is strong and that his father is supposed to play the villain, but this is too much," the bi-colored teen said, his words being aimed towards someone specifically. That person was Aizawa, and he was unaffected by this as he responded by saying, "Before you even ask, no, I won't be stopping this match unless time runs out," with his usual tired voice. Everyone was even more shocked upon hearing this, as Uraraka voiced their concern. "Why? He might get seriously injured out there," the brown-haired girl said, her voice being heavily weighed down by her worry. Aizawa didn't budge once again, as he sighed and answered by saying, "Because I need to make sure that he won't lose control again. You all saw how he behaved during the sports festival, and I can't have him repeating this behavior. We need to knock him down a few pegs, even if that means that he'll have to suffer through this brutality." With his tired voice, Class 1 was horrified now, for Aizawa was right. Izuku's behavior during the sports festival was not ideal, and they would be better off if it never happened again. But there was also something else. They didn't know what it was, but Aizawa's voice sounded like there was something else that bothered him. The class quickly gave up their attempts at figuring out what was happening in their teacher's head, and continued to observe the match. Izuku was thrown through countless buildings, destroying everything in his path. He couldn't do anything against his father, and he was now convinced that the teachers had planned this out. The green-haired boy was once again grabbed by the throat, before he was thrown straight into the ground. The impact stunned him for a while, so he couldn't move, until something else crashed into the wall next to him. Izuku looked to see that it was Bakugo, who looked like he had been battered into oblivion. "I think they set us up for failure here," Izuku said, grunting in pain as he did. Bakugo just got annoyed upon hearing this, as he responded by saying, "That much was obvious the second that they announced our opponents," while also grunting. Upon hearing this, Izuku tried to sit himself up. The green-haired boy grunted while slowly pulling himself up, as he said, "Damn, is this how it feels to fight against me?" With an almost sarcastic voice. Bakugo didn't seem to understand the sarcasm, as he got more annoyed and said, "Stop touting your own horn. I'll kick your ass any day of the week." While still grunting, Izuku was ready to retaliate by correcting his blonde friend, but he stopped when he realized something. He had been losing for the entirety of the exam because he was fighting his father. So what if that changed? "Junior, you're a genius," the green-haired boy said, sounding more serious now. Bakugo just looked confused after hearing this, as Izuku began explaining, "We need to switch opponents. I can't fight my father and you can't fight All Might. So we need to switch opponents if we want a chance at winning," the green-haired boy said, sounding like most of his pain had been numbed out. Bakugo was shocked upon hearing this, but he still got annoyed while saying, "You're forgetting something. I can't fight your father either. You may have a chance against All Might, and that's a big may." but there's no way that I will be able to defeat Omni-Man. Izuku understood what Bakugo meant by this, as he stood up while saying, "We don't need to defeat them. We just need to hold them off until we get an opportunity to escape. As for my father, Viltrumites don't have super senses." With a much calmer voice, Bakugo finally understood what Izuku intended to do, as he pulled himself back to his feet while saying, "You better be right about this." Kryptonian, with a voice that sounded like it was trying to suppress its annoyance, right as the duo stood up next to each other. Their opponents finally made their presence known. Omni-Man kept staring Izuku down, while All Might kept his focus on Bakugo. The two teens braced themselves slightly as they nodded towards each other before charging in. What happened next came as a shock to both the two fighting heroes and the observers in the monitor room. They had expected Izuku and Bakugo to continue their fight with their previous opponent, but that didn't happen this time, just as his father had done to him at the beginning. Izuku was now flying straight towards an unsuspecting All Might. They switched opponents. Kirishima then exclaimed, genuinely shocked by what he was seeing. Many other students had the same reaction, for they didn't expect this in the slightest. Aizawa, on the other hand, somewhat understood what was happening. It took them long enough to do this. They finally realized that they had no hope of winning with the way they had been fighting, so they changed their targets in an attempt to gain an advantage. Although that doesn't mean that their victory is guaranteed, the tired teacher said, sounding unaffected by what was happening on the screen. The reason was that Aizawa was right. This didn't mean that it was going to be any easier. The students then turned their attention towards the screen, observing the remainder of the match. Meanwhile, All Might was throwing and missing most of his punches, all while having to take the green-haired boy's attacks. Everyone in the monitor room was shocked, for the battle was nothing short of a spectacle. Both opponents seemed to be equal in strength, but All Might appeared to be a little stronger than Izuku. It wasn't a lot, but even the smallest of differences can have the largest of impacts on the surroundings. This exchange continued for a while, with both fighters seeming to be at a standstill with one another. That changed, however. In an instant, Izuku closed the distance between himself and All Might, seemingly against the blonde hero's will, before throwing a devastating punch to his face. Everyone looked on in shock, for it seemed that All Might was about to lose. But that turned out to not be the case. Right as it looked like the blonde hero had lost, he steadied himself. He quickly wrapped his arms around Izuku, tightening his grasp as he did. Everyone was once again stunned, for they finally understood what was happening. All Might took that hit on purpose, which in turn set him up to grab hold of Midoriya. Now that he has him within his grasp, he's essentially nullified his mobility. All Might has regained control of the battle, Todoroki said, explaining what was happening on the screen. The students seemed to be more awed upon hearing this, as they watched All Might crush the green-haired boy within his arms. The observers couldn't hear anything in the field, but they could still imagine that Izuku was grunting and screaming in pain. The green-haired boy was writhing around like an animal in a bear trap, desperately trying to escape the bone-shattering grip of his captor. The longer it progressed, the more hopeless it looked, and right now it seemed pretty grim. All Might didn't let go of his hold, and he seemed to tighten more every time that his prey struggled. The blonde hero had accounted for Izuku's mobility and worked against it, but not even he could have predicted what happened next. All Might's expression was suddenly filled with confusion, as his stature was slowly elevated upwards. This confusion spread into the monitor room, but they all quickly realized what was happening. All Might may have hindered Izuku from properly using his flight, but he still hadn't stopped him from using it. The green-haired boy was pulling the blonde hero up into the air with him, in what seemed to be another desperate attempt to escape. Everyone remained confused during these events, but they didn't get to think of a proper answer before Izuku suddenly slammed into the ground. Everyone jumped as this happened, slightly frightened by the result. They were all shocked and confused, but they quickly understood what Izuku tried to do. The green-haired boy had realized that he couldn't break himself free, so the only way to release himself was to hit All Might until he let go. The screen was covered in a cloud of smoke, masking the results from everyone, with an unnerving silence. Eventually the smoke cleared, only to reveal a battered Izuku on the ground. He was still awake, yet it was apparent that he had harmed himself by slamming his front into the ground. But that wasn't the concerning part. What was concerning was that underneath the green-haired boy was nothing but shattered asphalt. All Might was nowhere to be seen. Izuku dragged himself up on trembling legs, while keeping his eyes peeled for the number one hero that could be hiding within the residual smoke. It was quiet, too quiet, and not a single trace of All Might could be found anywhere. The green-haired boy was about to fly in an attempt to gain some altitude, but he was immediately stopped by a sudden force wrapping itself around him from behind. Izuku only managed to get a glimpse of what it was, but he already knew. It was All Might, holding the green-haired boy in a tight chokehold from behind. Izuku could immediately feel how he was unable to breathe. As such, he became more and more desperate to break loose. He tried to do the same thing again, only to find that All Might had dug his feet into the ground to anchor himself. He then tried to pry his arms open, but that didn't work either. The green-haired boy began to lose consciousness, but he didn't stop struggling. He could feel how his strength was leaving his body, and how he was losing his grip. Izuku had many thoughts going through his head, but they all shared a common theme. He was about to lose, but he didn't want that to happen. He knew that he was stronger than this. That's why he refused to give up here. The green-haired boy reached up for All Might's arms once again, tightening his grip around them. The observers saw this and wrote it off as a desperate, yet futile, attempt to break free. But they all had the shock of their life when blood suddenly burst out from there. Everyone was both shocked and horrified. Even the teachers were, as they watched the gruesome event in front of them. Soundpeats. This video is sponsored by Soundpeats and their new True Free 2 wireless earbuds to provide the next level of quality and comfort. Ever gone out for a run and have to readjust your buds every 5 minutes? How about worry about getting caught in the rain and ruining your $200 earbuds? Well, those days are behind you. With an ergonomic design created to stay on even through the most rigorous workout or function through a cascade of rain with its IP7 water resistance. Enjoy 20 hours of battery life and seamless switching between earbuds without interruptions and at a fraction of the price of most premium earbuds. Check out the new True Free 2 wireless earbuds in the link in the description. Also, know that using the link below, you won't only get an excellent audio experience, you'll be supporting the channel so we can continue to provide the highest quality content possible. Each purchase helps, so if you're on the lookout for a new pair of buds, we've got you covered. Well, what just happened? Uraraka exclaimed, horror being present in her voice. No one seemed to have an answer for her, until someone finally figured out what had happened. Midoriya. He didn't try to pull himself loose. He dug his fingers into All Might's arms. Todoroki answered, his cold voice now overrun with an equally cold shock. Everyone was even more stunned now, for it was brutal. It was understandable that one would do this in a dire situation, but they never expected Izuku to be the one doing it. The students didn't get to have another thought or comment about what was happening before Izuku charged in. The green-haired boy flew at top speed, while staying low towards the ground. All Might lowered his guard in an attempt to shield his legs, but was quickly met by a fist to the temple. The observers were once again shocked, for they had also been fooled by Izuku. The green-haired boy had stayed low in order to make All Might lower his guard. That way he wouldn't be able to defend against another attack. Izuku didn't stop and went in for another attack, only to be caught once again. All Might had grabbed Izuku into a bear hug, while also anchoring himself to the ground. Now the green-haired boy couldn't release himself by flying, and he wasn't able to grab onto his arms either. The blonde hero tightened his hold around Izuku, intending to end the fight between them, but he was forced to let go when the green-haired boy sent a headbutt right into All Might's face. He didn't stop there, as he continued to rain down punches onto the blonde hero. Awe and shock never left the expressions of the students, but one of them was even more shocked than the rest. It was Uraraka, and she was also worried. She recognized the aura that Izuku had around him, and the raging brutality that came with it. She had seen it before. It was during the USJ incident, when Izuku had completely annihilated the Namo. This only made her more worried, for even if Izuku had gained more strength, he lost his mind in the process, and she didn't want him to do something that he might regret. Uraraka's attention was brought back to the screen, as Izuku delivered another punch to All Might's face. The symbol of peace didn't back down, however, as he wound up for a counterattack, but it was quickly stopped when Izuku threw a full-powered punch straight into the right side of All Might's stomach. The blonde hero staggered severely, and even started to cough up blood, right before Izuku delivered the finishing blow to his face. All Might was thrown back into a building, with a cloud of smoke covering him. He was still clinging to consciousness, but he was too injured to continue the fight. Izuku barely got to assure his victory before he heard one of the loudest and most powerful explosions in his life. He turned to see that Bakugo was the cause of it, at the cost of his right arm, and behind him was his staggered but otherwise completely uninjured father. "Hey, Martian!" the explosive blonde shouted. As he reached out his left hand, Izuku was immediately knocked out of his trance. As he quickly took off towards his partner, he then grabbed Bakugo by the hand. Before heading towards the exit at top speed, Nolan managed to finally regain his senses after a few seconds. Bakugo was unable to put as much as a scratch on him, but his versatility made him hard to deal with, as he had mainly used his explosions to blind and distract him. He was going to chase after the teens, but by the time he had the option to do so, it was announced that they had managed to escape. The exam was over, and the two successors managed to best their predecessors. Class 1 was still in shock, for they didn't know how to process this. They were convinced that Izuku and Bakugo were going to lose this match, but they had been horribly wrong. Even though they had passed out the second that it was over, they still did it. "No way, they won," Kaminari shouted, still unable to believe what his eyes were showing him. Everyone in class shared his feeling, except for Todoroki, of course, while Aizawa was wearing a wide grin. Yes, they did it, despite it being nigh impossible. Despite all the odds being stacked against them, they refused to give up. They went beyond their limits, plus ultra style, the tired teacher said, his voice and expression filled with nothing but pride for his students' accomplishments. Outro. Thank you all for sticking around, and I hope that you enjoyed. Before you leave, we would just like to let you know that We the Celestials has many other channels for your entertainment and viewing purposes. All the information you'll need is right below here in the description, so feel free to check out all the other incredible projects our team creates. Secondly, on behalf of We the Celestials, I'd like to thank everyone involved in the production of today's awesome content. Their details will be in the description below. That's all for today's video. So goodbye and have a divine day.